Hey guys, and welcome to the 5th installment of Updated Builds, a series where I go over all the Warframes and I, as the title suggests, update their builds and then share them with you because, let's face it, a lot of the build videos that are made are very old and horrifically outdated. Now today we're gonna take a look at all the builds that I like to use on Ember and switch between them based on what I'm doing. And even though I have 3 builds for you today, there is a bit of an overlap going on. The first one focuses on the Flash Accelerant augment and the utility that comes with it in the form of the stagger, bonus damage and debuffing the enemies. The second build is focused around the Firequake augment for World on Fire, and this one is awesome for higher level missions because it provides an insane amount of crowd control over a very large area. And the final setup I have here is what I like to call Farm on Fire, and this is also a World on Fire setup, but instead of focusing on crowd control for sorties and stuff like that, it's geared more towards the star chart because it's what I like to use for farming resources, finding Atan sculptures and stars, or even medallions for the syndicates. So let's kick it off with build number 1, which is the one that focuses on Flash Accelerant. It's running Energy Siphon as its aura, which is kind of unusual for Ember. You generally want to go with Corrosive Projection because you're mostly doing heat damage, and heat damage isn't great versus armor, but I like Energy Siphon a lot more for this setup because it's going to provide more energy for spamming Accelerant. Then I'm using Power Drift and Intensify for a decent amount of power strength because it kind of double dips with this setup. It increases the effectiveness of Accelerant so enemies take more fire damage, but it also increases the effectiveness of Flash Accelerant so you will get more bonus heat damage. Then I'm using Prime Continuity, and this is mostly here for World on Fire so it doesn't drain as much energy because of negative duration, and if you don't have the primed version, the regular one is just fine. And it also helps to sustain Flash Accelerant on your party members. You don't really need it for yourself because you're going to be casting it a lot, so the buff will pretty much never run out on you, but your party members may not be close enough every time you cast it. Then to hit as many enemies and party members as possible, I'm using Augur Reach and Stretch. I did not want to go with Overextended because that would completely kill my strength. And then we're gonna slap on Flash Accelerant, which makes it so that every time you cast Accelerant, on top of momentarily staggering the enemies and making them take more fire damage, you will also buff yourself and all the party members within the range of Accelerant with 50% increased casting speed, which is not affected by power strength, and 50% bonus fire damage, which is affected by power strength. Then to make Flash Accelerant super cheap, I'm using Fleeting Expertise, which allows me to spam Flash Accelerant throughout the entire mission, and we're gonna top it off with 2 defensive mods of your choice. I'm personally using Vitality and Primed Vigor for loads of health and some extra shields, but you can use whatever you want. Now I made this build as sort of an alternative to the Firequake setup that we're gonna take a look at in a minute. I basically wanted a more hands-on build because I tend to go for more passive World on Fire setups. And I'm really happy with how the build turned out. It is very effective at what it does. It provides a stupid amount of crowd control over a large area, and if you're running with something like the Ignis, you're gonna see a pretty big damage increase as well. And let us not forget that you are also providing free natural talent to your entire party if they're in the range of your Accelerant. And I know that not a ton of builds go for natural talent, but it still helps, especially on caster setups. Now the gameplay isn't too complicated when it comes to this setup. You basically just run into a room, pop Flash Accelerant, which will stagger enemies, buff you and your allies, and then you just mow them down. Or alternatively, what you can do is simply turn on World on Fire, run into a room, pop Flash Accelerant, and watch the world burn. The one thing to bear in mind here is that it is extremely power hungry and in most cases not sustainable for very long. It does, however, do pretty good damage. Now, the reason why I like this setup so much is because, well, it's effective at what it does, but it also puts survivability in your own hands, because if you smack it as soon as you see an enemy and you use it effectively, you're pretty much never gonna get hit, because all the enemies will be staggered and dead long before they have a chance to hit you. Moving on to build number 2, which is focused around the Firequake augment. And this one is running Corrosive Projection for its aura for 2 reasons. Number 1, heat damage isn't great versus armor, so reducing it is really good. And number 2, Energy Siphon gets deactivated during World on Fire. But then again, if you want to run another aura, there's nothing stopping you. Now, when it comes to the mods, I am first of all using Prime Continuity to balance out Transient Fortitude, which kills a little bit of duration, and if you don't have the primed version, the normal version is just fine. And this is to help reduce the energy drain from World on Fire. Now, I know there's at least one person that already started typing, "What you talking about, mate? This bullshit doesn't work." Here we have World on Fire draining 1.71 energy every second. We then go back to the build, remove Primed Continuity without altering anything else, and voila, draining 2.9. So that's why we have Prime Continuity there. I am then running Transient Fortitude with Intensify and Power Drift for 200% power strength because I am running Overextended, which reduces it by 60, and I still wanted this to do decent damage. And I found that this was enough for the star chart, and once you get into sorties, Firequake's gonna take over and you're gonna get crowd control instead. Then to reduce the energy drain even further and to also reduce the initial cost on World on Fire, I'm using Streamline. And since this is a Firequake build, I'm then using Firequake, which makes it so that whenever an enemy is hit by World on Fire, they'll be knocked down. And this does open them up to ground finisher, so we can combo it with like Prisma Obex with the Entropy Detonation Augment and get some nice damage out of it as well. I'm then using Stretch and Overextended for a stupid amount of range, and I know a lot of people don't like Overextended on these kinds of builds. The reason I use it is because if you're playing a normal mission, it will pretty much knock enemies down before you see them. So if you run into a room, chances are the enemies are already on the ground, which is awesome, especially in high level missions where a single bombard or napalm could easily one-shot you. And finally, we top it off with a defensive mod of your choice. I'm personally using Vitality. Now, one thing to bear in mind here is that everyone mods for World on Fire differently. Some people like more range, some people like less, some people like more strength, some people like less, and yada yada yada. So while you can just copy the build and it's gonna work just fine, you might want to try other ones and see which one you like the most. Or you can just copy this build and then tweak it afterwards until you find something that you like. It also depends on what kind of content you want to do with it. I personally really enjoy this setup in the Plains of Eidolon, just farming bounties. It's really good for those. It has more than enough damage to kill everything in the low level bounties, so those are a breeze, and once you start going up in levels, Firequake's gonna kick in and you're gonna get a lot of crowd control over a pretty big area, which is important in the Plains because the enemies are spread much farther apart here. Though it is much better if you're doing bounties during the day, because if you're doing them during the night, you will constantly have to hack Eidolon Lars, because they are still a valid target for World on Fire, even if you take them down, so it will hit them instead of the enemies. And then of course there are sorties, which is what this build was originally made for. And here the build is just fantastic, because you're keeping everything locked down. And finally, we have the Farm on Fire setup, which is also a World on Fire setup, but this time it's focused more towards farming resources, add-on sculptures and medallions. And for this setup, I wanted a lot of sprint speed, so I'm running Sprint Boost in my Aura and Rush in my Exile slot. Then I'm once again running Prime Continuity to balance out Transient Fortitude, which with Intensify gives me 185% power strength. This is more than on the previous setup, and it's just to guarantee that I'm gonna kill everything on the star chart. I'm then running Stretch. I didn't want to go for Overextended or something like that because I don't need a ton of range. I just want to kill enemies that are basically within my line of sight as I'm farming. And then I'm once again running Streamline, which is going to reduce the initial cost on World on Fire, and it's also going to reduce the energy drain. I'm also running Thieves Wood here, which is going to give me 42 meters of loot radar, which is fantastic because I can just open the big map and see resource deposits, containers and stuff like that. And we once again top it off with some defense. I'm using Armored Agility here for even more sprint speed, a little bit of extra armor, and finally Vitality, but you can use whatever you want. And there is not much else to say about this build really, because it's kind of similar to the previous one. It just has different stat values. It has a less range, more damage, and it doesn't have the additional crowd control from Quake. Though it doesn't lose all the crowd control because it still sets enemies on fire, so they're gonna flail around for a bit. It's just a really simple build. You get into a mission, you pop World on Fire, you open up the big map, and you're running from container to container, breaking everything, getting loads of resources, while World on Fire kills all the enemies. And it is effective around the entire star chart. You can go onto Sedna with it, you can go onto Pluto, it doesn't really matter. And that's pretty much it for the build, so I thank you very much for watching. As always guys, I hope you've enjoyed the video and it was helpful, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.